And we're really excited to have these next three speakers up here. I believe it's all your first time at DevOps Days, right? This one here. So this will be all new speakers for DevOps Days, which we love. So without further ado, let's just get moving forward. Please put your hands together we have, trying to find the right place here, Meagan, Erin, and Amanda. So please give them your full attention. Thank you so much.
Oh, Mike. Small details.
Hello, everyone. My name is Meagan Cooney. I'm a full-stack engineer at Ibotta, working on everything from Vue to Terraform. And this talk is brought about a lot of the conversations that we've had in the past about DevOps and hiring and all of that.
Hello, everyone. Can we hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Hi, I'm Amanda Collins, and I am a software engineer at Ibotta, and I have done everything from application development to infrastructure development. I'm currently on the DevTools team.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erin Atkinson. I, up until just recently, was also with Ibotta. I'm currently with a company called HashiCorp, and I was on also the DevTools team and predominantly was on building pipelines and teaching people systems and infrastructure topics. So. Just to kind of start in, this is going to be a little bit of an uncomfortable conversation. We're talking about how DevOps can go awry, and DevOps really is near and dear to our hearts. And a lot of these things are really going to be easy to just kind of write off as, well, you're just not doing DevOps right, or like, oh, hey, if you just, that's not DevOps at all. Like, it's very easy to just kind of cop out and say these things, but lean into the uncomfortableness with us, because a lot of these things are like larger than just DevOps.
So we also wanted to define some of the terms that we've already used and that we will use later on in the talk. These are political coin, privilege, awry, and agency.
So political coin, also known as political capital, is a metaphor used in political theory to conceptualize the accumulation of resources and power built through relationships, trust, goodwill, and influence. You will often notice that the accrual of political coin will be based upon years of experience in the industry or years of experience at an organization, the trust and relationships that you have with other people. And as you accrue it, you can also spend it. So when you have projects that need extra assistance and things like that, it will be just like give and take.
One of the other words, definitions, concepts that we're going to be using a lot is privilege. It's used a lot in social science talk. A lot of what we're going to be talking here is involved in that, but also of just like a more pragmatic privilege of like if you're the only person in your department who has root access to these servers, your job's probably going to be a little bit easier than everyone else's. So.
And also we have awry, because a lot of people gave us feedback that when they saw our title, they were a little unsure of what we meant by it. So awry means away from appropriate, planned, or expected course, amiss. Another synonym is astray.
And then the last one we're going to go over is agency. In this context, it's not like, you know, a talent agency or anything. It's really the ability to be able to like chart your own course and make the decisions that you really want to or need to in your day-to-day.
So confession, sometimes we are the ones that are doing these things.
I've built things that have never seen the light of day.
Yeah, I have definitely stated strong and unreserved opinions to other developers.
I've rattled off acronyms to newer developers who then documented them, so thank you.
Mm-hmm. So if you identify with any of these topics, that's okay. There's an action item to take away or multiple action items to take away from each of them. I myself identify with Ivory Tower isolationism. An ivory tower is tall and bright, and only so many people fit into it. Some of those people helped build it, some have been invited in, and some have been placed in it. The people in the tower tend to already have established privilege, accrued political coin, and have been given some amount of implicit trust. The perspective within the tower is different from those who are not within the tower, and that difference of perspective is where a disconnect can begin to happen. However, not everyone who finds themselves in an ivory tower becomes isolated from those who are not in a tower. So according to the Oxford English Dictionary, ivory tower isolationism is a state of privileged seclusion or separation from the facts and practicalities of the real world. And it's that separation from the world outside of the tower is where it becomes problematic. So DevOps as a culture is the democratization of knowledge and agency. By being in an ivory tower, you risk isolating yourself from others, contradicting that spirit of democratization. This can lead to a dissolution of trust, because the spirit of democratization has transformed into something else entirely. The people outside of the tower stop trusting those within the tower because of this difference of perspective. And on the flip side, those within the tower stop trusting those outside the tower because of that lack of trust and the shift in the boundaries of the power dynamic that was already present. So what elevates you above others? Do you already have elevated privileges or seniority? Do you have permission to do something that others don't and don't have the same permission to do? So if you've answered yes to any of these, you're probably in an ivory tower. And recognizing that you're in one is the first step to being able to do something about it. So you can try to simply leave the tower, but that doesn't guarantee that the tower is going to go away because there might still be others inside. You can try to take down the tower, but it's harder than it looks, and you're going to spend a lot of energy trying, and it might still be standing at the end of all of that effort. So think of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. It's still standing despite gravity, foundation issues, and what have you. Or you can try and build up the area around the tower to make it more accessible for others. Think of the Royal Mile leading up to the hill to Edinburgh Castle. So the takeaway from this is to focus on empowering and empathizing with those that are not in the tower.
So one way that you can work on empathizing with those who aren't in the tower is to limit the use of prescribed edicts. So what is a prescribed edict? Well, so the word prescribed edicts and edict actually kind of mean the same thing. So the definition of edict is just an official order or proclamation issued by a person in authority. So sometimes that authority is kind of very official, or in a lot of these cases that we're going to be talking about, it can be more of an assumed authority. So a lot of the times it's a subject matter expert in a position of perceived authority making decisions that affect others that may or may not be adequately communicated out. So an example of this is something that would be great, like we're going to be using CI/CD, becomes an effect, we're going to continuously deploy everything. And it doesn't take in any of the nuance of any of the existing systems or any of the existing culture, and so it becomes more of something that's just being assigned and is happening. So how can this happen in general? So a lot of the times, though, it becomes out of the people's best intentions. It's because they want to standardize best practices, or when we're introducing a new technology, we want to make sure that we have kind of a spread of knowledge and that everyone can implement in a way that we know that we can support. But also, a lot of the times this can be reactive because access is risky. So we talked a lot about in the ivory tower isolationism. A lot of this comes out of people restricting access, and a lot of the times these edicts come out of the desire to protect access. And also, the maintenance of both old and new systems is expensive, so by having a prescribed edict that we're now going to all move to the new thing is a way to get around that. So another term that you see a lot in DevOps culture is cargo culting, which is kind of the idea by following different principles, we can kind of bring about this better idea of DevOps. And a lot of the times these edicts come about of a way of trying to institute this and move it forward. So another thing that can happen, though, are unintentional edicts, where not everyone has the same weight when they discuss these problems or implement these solutions. So their opinion might be taken with a stronger force, so it comes across as an edict. And also, how do you improve these outcomes? Trust is a two-way street. A lot of the times, others lack the context for this decision, so just communicating the why is very important and can actually really resolve the sense that it is an edict. And also, a lot of the times, this still might be the best decision. Even though it is coming across as an edict, it might be the right thing to do. So it's a lot about the messaging. And also, sometimes you can have kind of the reverse of this, where the edict is stakeholder-driven. So an example of this is We had the really best intentioned effort that we're going to set up a new deployment pipeline. But then the stakeholder says, well, actually, this is going to go live on Thursday. So a lot of the times, these edicts are something that you have to plan around, and you might not have the agency and be able to take effect. So what are some of the action items that can come out of this? DevOps requires collaboration and trust, so edicts must be discussed and potentially challenged. But the counterpoint to all of this is that this doesn't necessarily mean that everything has to be like designed by committee and just torn to death and discussed over and over again. But it's all about the messaging and making sure that those who are going to be implementing it have a say and feel bought into the decision.
So we've talked a lot about like how ivory towers and edicts can really like affect people outside of teams. But let's kind of move onwards and inwards internally to your team, and how emotional labor and the balance and distribution of that can really affect those inside of your team. So what is emotional labor? This is one of the first definitions of emotional labor. This actually came out of a study around, what is it? Sorry, flight attendants. Could not remember that word. But flight attendants, where you're actually kind of selling as the labor that you're doing, the emotion of calmness and happiness of saying, hey, even in the face of somebody who's a very angry or discontented or disillusioned airline customer, you have to sell this face of really nice positivity. So what does this mean in the larger context for tech and for DevOps? And so really what we're seeing here is going to be, we're doing those same things, but kind of unintentionally, quietly, invisibly, to make sure all of our teams are working effectively. Pretty much anytime you're doing things like meetings, downtimes, building relationships with people, a lot of these things that aren't necessarily incentivized or monetized for your company really do make the actual running of your company go smoothly. Documentation is absolutely 100% emotional labor, because the intro to most of the tools that you're running is going to be documentation, and so it really does make that difference. So moving into it, the harm is really when it's unbalanced. A lot of the times this can kind of get pushed onto or thrown over a wall, different than the DevOps wall, but very similar of if you have people who are either junior or don't have as much political coin, they could take the lion's share of performing this emotional labor for your team, of making sure everybody's happy. Oh, it's your birthday, happy birthday. It's not actually. So you risk burnout and underappreciation when you do this. Basically, you're saying, I don't see any of my work be visible and actually appreciated, and I'm doing all of this work, I'm leaving. So trying to wrap that up of what can happen and why. For the tragedy of the commons, I like to think of the kitchen sink. If you don't do your dishes in the kitchen sink, it's not that bad for a day or two. If we all have an office kitchen sink and we all don't do the dishes, we don't have a kitchen sink anymore. I'm sorry. We have a pile of dishes. And that problem, cleaning up from those problems, is really what I'm calling the tragedy of existing systems. Because who has political coin, who has privilege, who has agency to make those choices, how your prioritization and load balancing of your work, that's all going to fall on existing systems if you're not intentional about it. And so, okay, cool, who's taking all of your documentation? Who's going to stand-ups from other teams? Who's doing these things that are really doing the day-to-day, making your team effective? So how do you fix this? Really, a lot of it's just very straightforward. If everyone's contributing and everybody's actually seeing what's happening, I think one of the teams I was on, we actually just did JIRA tickets for this. But if you hate writing tickets, however you want to make it visible, we measure what matters and we measure what we value. So if you actually value your team being effective, make sure that that's visible. You're going to have less burnout, you're going to have less underappreciation in your feelings. One of the other things is saying, okay, I know that we don't like it, but how do you do it easily? Okay, let's just have a runbook on it. Let's do a rotation on it. Let's do it on a Friday. We're not in a CI/CD yet. Let's just do a documentation Friday and just pair on documentation. Go to a coffee shop. Go to a bar if that's your thing.
So another aspect of this emotional labor is the fire hose of unsolicited opinions. So what do we mean by this? This is when unsolicited opinions are answers to questions that are not asked. And also, they're also outside the scope of the original request. So, how do we improve outcomes in this situation? Providing opinions does not necessarily equate to providing help, and it's very important to get down to what is the actual scope of the original question. And also, when these opinions are being given, it really implies a lack of trust in the recipients. And if the person who is bearing the brunt of this fire hose has imposter syndrome, they might also not have the feeling that they can actually question anything that's being said and challenge these opinions. And so it really kind of is unequal, and they then don't really have the best outcome of this. So how do we improve advice in these situations? Focus on the answer to this single question. And we're also not really saying that at any time, don't give any unsolicited opinions. The best thing to do is to build up a relationship for mentorship. And so that then, when you do give this advice, it comes from a place of trust and communication, and your audience is going to be much more receptive.
So yeah, a lot of the things that we end up doing are developer tools to help with DevOps culture. And it's really important to build those relationships when you're testing those tools, especially if you're testing in production, which is just, hey, here, try this. So what does it really mean to be autocratic? An autocrat is a bad thing. Being autocratic is also bad, but it's more neutral bad, I feel. You're just not taking into account. It's not like, you're a despot or something. But this is really what we're talking about when we're being autocratic. You're just not taking into account somebody's feelings about something. So in tech, we're saying when we're testing, if you're not taking into account really your end user, you're not really taking their full feedback. You're basically getting to do this where it's like, congrats, you get to try this new thing. I'm sure it'll be great. Tell me in a month how it goes. Really, nobody likes to just be given a tool and said, you get to try this. You need to have that relationship bought in and have, well, this is the benefit that your team's we hope that your team's gonna get. Tell us how that goes. Hey, cool, I really want that benefit. I'm gonna be more bought into it. And a lot of this can come from a lean and agile kind of idealism where we want to get the MVP kind of just out the door, get that really quick feedback, but we don't have as much of a vertical MVP as more of a horizontal MVP where you have the product, you don't have a bunch of the testing frameworks around it. So when you don't have those frameworks around it, this is where that can be harmful. We're testing with people on a lot of these tools. We're testing changes of tools against what people's usages are and the cultural and process changes that we want to implement by these tools. So if you have this, there's a bunch of types of change. And this was a great quote that I found on the types of change and just in general your organizational change that you're making. But it works for tools. If you're making a bunch of tool changes and you're giving those to end users or even a 10% canary group of people of hey, UX, UI, let's test this. If that's a negative test, if that's a negative change for that person, if they experience as a negative change, that's gonna make a withdrawal from their bank of potential changes. If you start to I don't know, make them go into the red on that, then all of these systems of I'm gonna get burnt out, I just don't want to deal with this testing, is all gonna come back there. And for a lot of people, whether or not a change is positive, negative, or neutral really comes down to how bought into it and how much agency do you have around it. If you're bought in for the why, I don't know any engineer who would oh, just tell me what to do and I don't care why we're doing it. Maybe that is you, and that's fine. But most of the people that I've run into really do care about why are we doing this? Like, what's the benefit for this? And having that agency and bought in of like, I know and buy into that benefit really helps that. So how do you kind of get this back as a true revolutionaries? Like, let your stakeholders take back that means of feedback. If you're not really ready for how this feedback is going, let them build that feedback for you. And maybe it's a like cop out of just throwing it over the wall, but at least work with them of like, what kind of feedback do we need? What kind of feedback do you want to be giving? Like, how often, how quickly? Because 6 months from now for your first feedback loop may be too long for it, and everybody's just like, I hate this tool, and they could have told it to you in the first week. Again, a lot of this is just the like, hey, why are we doing this? And also, oh, we've just done like 6 tool releases to this same canary group, and they got to test all of it. Maybe we should do another canary group. So that's basically where we're at.
So another reason to consider the broader context is to mitigate highly speculative development. So speculative means engaged in, expressing, or based on a conjecture rather than knowledge. You're basically guessing. So have you ever caught yourself saying these things? I think this will solve our users' needs. I think this addresses their pain points. That's speculating. So this cartoon depicts why speculating is so common. How a user explains it, how a team understands it, and what the user actually needs look nothing alike. So the explanation of the internalized interpretation of the explanation heavily depend on how a problem is communicated. But even the best explanation can still fail to hit the target if the context of the problem is not well understood. So when you build something based on conjecture, you may be creating solutions for problems that may not exist and placing interest in a subject without any meaning. You may be designing something for the purpose of bringing it to a satisfying conclusion. And while scratching that technological itch may be satisfying, that doesn't necessarily serve your users' needs or address their pain points. So why does this happen? Well, one reason can be if you don't have enough empathy for your users. Without a sufficient degree of empathy, not saying you don't have any at all, you could be solving a pain point without understanding the effect the solution has or misunderstand why it was painful to begin with. So another reason can be if you don't have enough context. You may have addressed a visible pain point, but you might be leaving the underlying true pain point intact, which might not really move that emotional needle for your users. Or maybe it will, but in the direction you don't want. So to recover from this, you can ask yourself, what do your users need or wants to achieve? There are a couple different ways you can help answer this question. One is utilizing the 5 whys, like how we do in retrospective. Why is this frustrating to do? Because we use roles to access everything. Well, why do we use roles to access everything? Because roles can cleanly delineate permissions. Well, why do we need roles to cleanly delineate permissions? And so on and so forth until you've reached a sufficient level of understanding to proceed with your solution design. Another thing you can do is have a context observation day. Go out and embed onto the team or teams that you're wanting to help. Watch how they're using or following the product or process you're looking to improve and ask questions. What are they doing? Why are they doing it? How do they understand it? So once you have your solutions in place, you want to remember to reassess them now and later. What may have helped your users achieve their goals a month ago, a year ago, 5 years ago, might not be the same solution that your users need today. Are your solutions still relevant, or do they need adjusting based on the changes of context? Or is it time to even sunset them? Whatever the answer is, you'll want to plan accordingly. So the takeaways from this are to conduct a context observation day before you design anything, and reassess your solutions regularly to make sure that they're still relevant and adjust accordingly.
So we've talked a lot about like what is potential ways that culturally things can go wrong, but when we're talking about a retrospective, we're really wanting to get to kind of root causes. And really, most of the things that we've been talking to have been coming down to a number of like main themes that are kind of systemic. So harmful power dynamics. Those are going to exist in your company from day one, potentially, from day 5 billion. If you're creating a DevOps culture, or if you're mid-DevOps culture, these are things that DevOps doesn't exist in a vacuum, to be cliche. they're going to affect how effective your DevOps culture is actually going to be adopted and bought in on the organization level. Lack of trust or breakdowns of trust can really harm how your tools, how your back-end thought processes, mental models of a DevOps culture are actually getting, again, bought in or brought around to. And again, lastly, lack of communication or just bad communication paths, or maybe not bad, but harmful or limiting communication paths that exist within your company are potentially limiting how effective your DevOps or your DevOps mission in a company is really going to be. So that is it. Thank you very, very much.
Sure.
I mean, we can. Yeah, 4 minutes.
Okay. Sure. Okay. Whoa, that's loud. Okay, let's do some questions. Who's got a question? Somebody give me a hand so I can throw this thing.
Bueller.
It's okay not to have questions.
No? Okay, yeah. If they don't have questions, that's totally fine. We can. Oh, here we go. Come on back here.
Good cat.
I didn't quite get when you were talking about opinions or answers to unasked questions and focus on the single question. Do you have an example of what you're talking about there to make it concrete?
Are you referring to the section on highly speculative development, just to confirm?
Or the Firehose of opinions.
I feel like it's a fire hose of opinions.
Okay.
You want to take that? So just to reiterate, your question was just to clarify on an example for focusing on just the question.
Yeah.
So if I get asked a question about something that I love Terraform. I'm very, very passionate about it. And if you want to do an open space and we'll talk, be my guest. But if you ask me as a question and I'm a senior engineer and I'm coming to you as a subject matter expert and you're asking me, hey, how am I going to do this provider backend, specifically to a provider backend? And then I go on to a larger question of, well, this is how Terraform handles S3 connections. And then I go on to another thing. It's if I focus on just the question you asked, there's a lower chance that I'm going to overwhelm you with this fire hose of just oh, hey, this is actually a really cool thing. You shouldn't do this. You should actually do this. Because a lot of my preferences around how you want to configure Terraform backends aren't necessarily best or worst practices. They're just what my practices are. So is that a good enough? That's from what your question was. That was kind of what I was seeing.
Any other questions? One in the back?
Okay. Yeah, so a lot of it comes down to intentionality, being intentional and cognizant of what's going on in the power dynamics that you exist in. And so oh, cool, I have some privileges as a senior engineer, as, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of it comes down to, if you're cognizant of it, you can actively offset it. But in the team context, a lot of it ends up just being take it out of an individual's hands. If you have a framework for mentorship where you're saying, cool, we're going to pair on this. So yeah, we have our junior engineers doing documentation, but we also have our senior engineers doing documentation. And oh, hey, here's some nuance that would have had to have the junior engineer do a PR for your documentation and then have it come through the PR process. Maybe it was missed. Maybe then they're going to have to do another PR to get that. If you just pair, then now you get data and knowledge transfer as well as a more balanced way of doing some of those things. that's just for documentation. For a lot of the other things, rotations really help. Again, when we fall back on problem spaces, we have coping mechanisms, and not all of those coping mechanisms are great. If you have maladaptive coping mechanisms, build out better ones, and train yourselves in the good times to actually have those as rote, so that then if it does get to a bad point, you can just fall back on that and say, oh, cool, we already have this rotation, so we're not gonna, get into a part where, yeah, could you go and do that, please? I'm sorry, I have so many tickets. I gotta architect this thing. I gotta do this other thing. I gotta go to all of these other random things that are just my pet projects. But you have plenty of time, so there you go. If you take that out of the picture and make it so that the framework and the team has those systems, so that it's not actually on one person or a group of people to make those choices, then it democratizes who's doing that. Does that, yeah.
Okay, we got time for one more. Any other questions? No? Okay. We'll put your hands together one more time for our speakers.